Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Independent Thought. My name is Desmond Price, and for today's episode, we'll be talking about the electric slide. No, not the dance. That was just a catchy name for the episode, obviously. We're going to be talking about the electrified future of our country. I'm going to get to that here in a moment, but for today's episode, we'll be using information from Donut Media, Vox, the New York Times, the White House, and Yale University. I want to first thank all of the subscribers, the people who come back each and every episode, who keep coming back to Independent Thought. You are greatly appreciated. And if this is your first time, welcome. Welcome to the podcast. There will be a brand new conversation taking place with me and my guest after our break, just so that you know. So let's dive right on into our main topic of the day. So, why are we talking about electricity, the electric of our future? What am I talking about here? Well, first, let me just set the scene really quickly for everyone. I, like millions of people in the country, was watching the Super Bowl this past week, and I could not help but notice just how many commercials were featuring electric cars. Now, this kind of, stuck out a little bit to me, because I do know, as I reported on earlier in this season, about like 6 months ago, the current electric market in America is about, at the time, was about 80% owned by one company, by Tesla. And even though they have such a dominant share of the market, and they still actually have 66% of the market, the total market for electric cars in America is pretty small. I think, relatively speaking, in 2021, only 3% of all cars bought were electric vehicles, 5% were hybrids. So it's still a relatively small market for the electric vehicles here in America. But obviously, there is a push to have more electric vehicles here in America. President Biden was talking about how he wanted to have like hundreds of thousands of charging stations put all across the country. They're giving out tax incentives to people who buy electric cars. There's a push to get electric cars. Now, this is overall a good thing. I mean, if there are still people out there who still have the debate in their heads about whether or not, electric cars are actually more sustainable than internal combustion engine cars or just regular cars, I don't understand how you can still have that debate. I mean, I think it's been long addressed just how much of an environmental impact that cars have on the environment, not just with the fuel that they burn, but also just taking into effect how much emissions go into the air due to their manufacturing, their transportation, the actual mining of fossil fuels, the refinement of oil in refineries all over the country. But just in case there's anybody left who is trying to figure out just how much of a difference there is in environmental impact between electric cars and regular internal combustion cars, I have this great clip for all of you from Donut Media. Here's the clip.
We know that over the average lifespan of a car with an internal combustion engine, it will emit roughly 57 metric tons of CO2. Over the same time period, the average EV is responsible for 28 metric tons of emissions, less than half of that of an ICE engine. Despite the fact that electric vehicles make more CO2 during their production, they more than make up for it by not having any emissions during use. Taking into account the emissions produced by electric power plants that electric vehicles source their power from, the national average for an EV is around 2 metric tons per year. So that means the average EV will become more efficient than a gas-powered car between 6 months to 2 years of driving it. In fact, even the least efficient electric vehicle with the dirtiest power source, like a coal power plant, will be better for the environment than the most efficient gas engine after a certain period of time. Electric vehicles in states with access to cleaner electricity like windmills, solar, and hydroelectric power plants are significantly more efficient.
So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork a little bit for why exactly electric cars are obviously better for the environment, let's get into the root of this episode. Let's talk about why I'm bringing this up, what exactly needs to change about our current system, and how can we all get involved in this conversation, in this system. So the first thing I want to say is I'm very excited to see that we are making a legitimate push towards sustainability, towards renewable energy. But do want to pump the brakes a little bit here, because while it is a good thing that we are pushing towards this change of electric cars, electrified energy, the first thing that we have to address is how we actually produce electricity in this country. So, and I touched on this again in my geothermal episode back in August of last year, but 60% of our electricity that we generate in America is generated from fossil fuels. So let's just address this problem right face on, right? So even if every single car in the country was now an electric car, you still have to deal with the reality that more than half of the electricity that we generate comes from fossil fuels. So we're still dealing with a very fossil fuel heavy environment, even in a society that has no fossil fuel cars. So still have to address that. We need more investments into solar, wind, hydro, and again, geothermal energy, this untapped behemoth that people are not giving enough just investment into. So the question then becomes is like, okay, let's just say, even though that's not the case right now, but let's say that we also invest into that. And we have, solar plants, hydroelectric plants, wind farms, people actually finally utilizing geothermal. Then what happens next? Like, is everything better then? And unfortunately, the answer is still no. No, it's not. And this is where I'm going to turn now to a Vox video that I came across. And I'm going to have this linked in the episode description because this Vox video lays it out very well. So for those of you who don't want to go watch the video, I'm going to give you some brief notes here. Basically, one of the big hiccups that we're having into having a more renewable energy rich future is the fact that with this renewable energy, it needs to be transmitted from where we're getting it. And so, for instance, a lot of the solar and wind energy that was going to be produced in the future will be coming from the middle of the country, mostly the Great Plains states, Montana, all the way down to like New Mexico, and then over to like Minnesota, and then again, like down like to Texas, that little like block in the middle of the country. Most people, in the scientific community believe that the vast amount of wind farms and solar plants are going to be built in this alley of the country. And so the question then becomes, how do you get the energy that is produced or siphoned from that area of the country into essentially into the East and West coasts? Because as it currently is set up right now, there are power plants around the country, basically everywhere, and they don't really have to travel that far because there's so many of these plants everywhere. But with solar and wind, you can't put solar, plants everywhere. You can't put wind farms everywhere. They're basically going to be concentrated in the middle of the country. So you have to transmit the energy out. So therein lies having to build a bunch of massive power lines, a bunch of massive transmission lines. Now, not only do we need more transmission lines, you're going to need bigger ones. You're going to fix the ones that we currently have. Apparently, our energy demand, and this is probably obvious, is going to increase as we're electrifying everything, but it's going to increase, the demand is going to increase between like 40 to 100% if we electrify our grid to replace fossil fuels. Now that is a massive increase, but that makes sense. If you're changing everything that's currently natural, like fossil fuels into these renewable electric resources here, then obviously there's going to be a massive increase in the amount of energy that we're using. So yes, we are going to need more infrastructure to transmit this new amounts of energy that we're going to be needing to have. So obviously, the Biden administration is not completely ignorant to this. President Biden has said that he wants to invest into this, and he also that he wants to cut emissions by half in the US by the year 2030. That is the goal right now. Not only that, but with the recent passage of the infrastructure bill that does not have any kind of catchy name like Build Back Better, it's just called the infrastructure bill. There was $65 billion allocated to transmission lines for this exact purpose and for what they call quote unquote clean energy technologies. This was in a little press release that was put out by whitehouse.gov. I'll have that linked in the description as well. So you think, yes, that is a huge sum of money in order to address this problem. Surely that has fixed the problem. The answer is again, no. Unfortunately, according to the studies that I am seeing here, to fully fund these transmission lines, it seems though we need somewhere in the neighborhood of actually $320 billion. And that's just for the transmission lines. That's not also including what is expected to be around $450 billion for solar plants. That's not also including what is estimated to be $500 billion to fully fund the new wind farms that we're going to need. Now, you add that up, obviously, we're talking about well over $1 trillion. And in this day and age where everyone's talking about inflation this and inflation that, a lot of people are going to be scared about a number that large. Democrats and Republicans both have a very familiarly said line that they both like to say over and over and over again. I think it's everyone's favorite line in Washington at this point. And that line is, how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? Right? That's basically their favorite thing to say. How are we going to pay for it? Funny that question never comes up when we're talking about the military budget, but I'll just keep saying that over and over again because we never ask how we're going to pay for the military budget. Anyway. Now, on the Republican side, they've never really cared about this issue. Now, I want to distinguish here for a second that I'm not talking about Republican voters. I know that there are some Republican voters who care, but Republican officials, elected representatives, they don't really care all that much. So if you're one of those few Republican listeners who is listening to my podcast right now, this is your chance to reach out to your representatives. Ask them why they do not give a shit about any kind of environmental bills or environmental funding. This is probably one of those times where we need to be funding this kind of stuff. In the 2020 primary, all 40,000 people who were running to be the next president on the Democratic side, they were saying, obviously it wasn't 40,000, it was more like 10,000, but all 10,000 people who were trying to run for president back in 2020, they all kept saying how much of an existential threat that climate change was. Existential threat that climate change was. They all had individual town halls that were put on by the Sunrise Movement, where each one of them was making their sincere pledge to save our planet. And these same Democrats apparently were okay with only allotting $65 billion for a project that needed well over $1 trillion. So the next question does become, well, let's be fair for a second. Do we actually have the money to pay for something like this? Like if we actually wanted to, if there was actually the will to do that, do we legitimately have the funding to go ahead and pay for a project that this large? It is a question worth asking. And again, before I actually get to the number I have here in front of me, I'm also going to just poke again at the military budget, which gets $800 billion every year. But besides that, there was a study conducted at Yale that said that just in the year 2020, coal, oil, and gas companies in America received $6 trillion in subsidies. To be specific, they said 5.9 trillion. I rounded up to 6. I'll have this article linked in the episode description as well. So my point is, we have the funding. We've been told by several people on the Democratic side, at the very least, that climate change is an existential threat. We have Biden saying he does want to cut emissions, but the bill that's supposed to be the centerpiece of his administration so far, this infrastructure bill, when it was passed, they didn't even pass 1/10 of the funding needed to address the problem. So what gives? On the campaign trail, Biden time and time again said that he wanted his presidency to be a transformative presidency. In fact, someone noted this in the New York Times. An author by the name of Jennifer Medina wrote this back in August 26th of this past year. She says, during his campaign, Joe Biden made no secret of the presidential legacies he aspired to, frequently invoking FDR and Lyndon B. Johnson. The two Democratic presidents both passed sweeping legislation that transformed the country, and Mr. Biden didn't hide his plans to do the same. Now, 10 months into his presidency, his initial proposals have been chipped away by members of his own party, and critics say what's left is less like the New Deal and more like a shell of itself. Now, I couldn't agree more, because what has been left over of that infrastructure bill and Build Back Better is currently, as we know, dead. It's just not adequate enough. It's not enough for someone who claims that he wants to be a transformative president. Let's talk about what transformative presidents actually did. Since he referenced FDR, let me reference FDR for a second. In 1935, Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed the Rural Electrification Act. At the time, electricity in this country was seen more as like a luxury, something found mostly in cities. Only 3% of farm homes and rural homes had access to electricity. 24 years later, in the year of 1959, 99% of all homes in rural America had access to electricity. That is profoundly changing the landscape of a country. If President Biden and the rest of the Democratic Party are as serious about climate change as they've been telling us that they are for the last few years, and if they have the true desire to cut emissions like they say they do, and they really want to invest in this new electric car market and this new electric, just a renewable energy market, then we need to see a more concrete investment into the infrastructure that is necessary in order to make that change happen, because their words are not matching their actions. And this is the part of the episode where we all come in. Because again, I'm going to keep saying this because it's as true today as it was the last time I said it, time and time again. Politicians are going to come asking for your vote this year. When they do, tell them that you have desires of your own, that you care about the environment, and that you need to see concrete, actual investments into a renewable energy future, not just some pandering, not just some virtue signaling, not just some empty words that don't actually have any policy behind them, but true policy legislation, true legislation that will actually go towards fixing our broken infrastructure currently, our climate legislation. We need real climate legislation that's actually going to make some transformations in this country, because what we currently have isn't it. That 65 billion is not enough to truly address the problems that we all have, and it's a drop in the bucket for something that claims to be an existential threat. So for those of you who are interested, please reach out to your local, state, federal candidates, elected officials. I mean, these people, they are going to come begging for your votes here pretty soon. I mean, if you're in the state of Texas, I mean, the primary has already begun. just down there in the state of Texas right now. So early voting has already started in the state of Texas. If that's where you are right now listening to this, these people are always asking for votes. Ask for something in return. Just don't let people think that they're going to ride the whole, like blue no matter who or red no matter who, like wave all the way to the general election. Like, don't let them get away with that. And if you want to call your current reps on the federal level, the number is 202 224 3121. You can reach your congressperson or your senator through that number. Call them, leave them a voice message, or send them an email, whatever you prefer. Just tell them to make real investments into the infrastructure that we need in order to finally divest and move away from fossil fuels, which are burning up what's left of our climate. So I want to thank everyone for listening to this first half of the episode. If you liked this half of the episode, please go ahead and share this on social media and tag Independent Thought, whether that's on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Discord, LinkedIn. People are on LinkedIn. The 3 people who are still on Snapchat, if you're one of those 3 people still on Snapchat, go ahead and DM me and let me know if you're one of those 3 people who's still on Snapchat. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will have my guest for this week for a brand new conversation. So stay tuned after a few words from our sponsors. Welcome back from the break, everyone. Thank you for sticking with us through this episode of Independent Thought. Once again, if you liked this episode, please go ahead and share this episode on social media and tag Independent Thought. That is the best way to just help the podcast out. Just help the podcast out. We're trying to grow people, trying to like meet new people, meet new audience members. You can help us grow by sharing this episode. I want to thank not just the subscribers, but the patrons, all the people who are subscribed to my Patreon right now. And if you're not subscribed, don't you want to be a cool person who subscribes to the Patreon? Like, all the cool people are on Patreon right now. The link is in the episode description, everyone. Let's find each other on Patreon these days. No, but in all seriousness, I do appreciate everyone who's on Patreon, who invests into the podcast. I'm expecting to do a lot more with this podcast and the going on, not just the rest of this year, but going forward. Speaking of going forward, I want to talk about what's coming next. We still have 2 more full episodes and another bonus episode. I actually have the option of like 3 different bonus episodes that I already have pre-recorded. I'm not sure which one to release. I'm going to figure that out pretty soon. But speaking of things going forward, again, I kind of teased in a previous episode that there'll be a new format for season 5. And I kind of want to hear some thoughts about how you guys feel about this. I've been told by several people that sometimes the episodes are too long. Now I can appreciate that. Maybe what was consumable, in the last 2 years when there was, lockdowns and people not being able to go out or not wanting to go out, that a longer episode was more digestible. But now that things are kind of opening back up and people's schedules are becoming less forgiving, that maybe an hour-long episode is just not as easy as it used to be. So one of my thoughts, I'm not sold on it yet, but one of my thoughts is to have the episodes kind of broken up. So I was thinking of, instead of having one 1-hour episode throughout the week, I would do the main segment as its own episode, and then the guest segment released maybe like 2 days later in a separate episode, and then doing a third episode, which would be another like little like 20-minute clip. And that third one would just be whatever the news of the week is. So I could always like stay active with whatever's going on during the week. And so there's always some level of current events that I'm talking about. So we're not just doing, while I enjoy doing topics like geothermal and lead and drone strikes, I also want to stay current with whatever is going on in the news right now. So that's kind of what I'm thinking of, maybe like 3 20-minute little episodes throughout the week versus the one like hour long one. So let me know how you feel about that. That is one of the format ideas I'm tossing around. So closing out this episode, I want to just again come back to the first topic as I normally do. When I was seeing all the different electric car vehicle commercials going through the Super Bowl, it was very mixed emotions for me because on one hand, I'm excited to see like actually investments being made by private companies into the electric vehicle market. At the same time, I'm always worried that somehow, some way, the oil industry, big oil, will find a way to live much longer than it should. Because it's very, I just feel as though it's very easy for them to find a way to survive throughout all of this because maybe they try to in one way or another stifle, through lobbying efforts, of course, stifle the production of new infrastructure for renewable energy, which, on one hand, you would think that the electric car market blowing up would be bad for them. But if you're still producing electricity via fossil fuels, then they can still carve out a way to continue to make profit and continue to be relevant in our country. That is one thing that I'm very weary of. And so I just want to make everyone kind of aware of it, that even though we're seeing this new investment into electric, that we need to be aware of all the details, because as it currently stands, our electricity still comes from fossil fuels. It still comes from fossil fuels, more than 60% of it. So just something to be aware of as we're going forward. I just know for a fact, especially coming up here in the next month, President Biden's going to give his State of the Union speech. He's probably going to talk about all the greatness that he's done, which that's kind of laughable. I just don't want people to have the wool pulled over their eyes as far as what has actually been accomplished with the Biden administration versus what they said they were going to do versus, again, what they, like claim they wanted to do on the campaign trail. It feels like those keep taking steps down. So I just want to keep everyone aware of, where we're at versus where we should be. So I hope you guys appreciate that. If you have any suggestions for future episode topics, I am currently curating a list for season 5. So throw your topic ideas at me and I'll add it to my list if I don't already have it on there. And if I like the topic, let's be serious. So with that being said, thank you all again for tuning into this episode of Independent Thought. We will see you in the next one. Have a good week.